we can go ahead and start the recording. And yes, welcome to this month's Food Safety Foundations. Like always, I just have a few housekeeping tasks and reminders to go over first. Please keep your microphone on mute until the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can type them in the chat and we'll answer them. To find the chat feature in your Zoom window, look for the speaking bubble icon or the chat button. The chat does default to all webinar participants or everyone in the to field. To send a direct message to one individual, click the down arrow after everyone and select that specific participant. If you need or want captions, you can enable these by finding the CC or Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you do not see the CC button, look for the More buttons with the 3 dots. Click on the button to enable captions. So again, welcome to this month's webinar, Canning Low Acid Foods. This food preservation topic is part of the Food Safety Foundation series. During the January, February, and March webinars, we set the stage for food preservation by discussing pathogens that can contaminate food and cause foodborne illness, what pathogens need to grow, and how your actions can impact this growth, and then best practices for a thorough sanitation routine. In April, we reviewed a variety of equipment needed for different food preservation methods with an emphasis on how these contribute to the safety of your value-added and preserved foods. And then in May, we discussed making preserved fruit spreads like jams and jellies. In June, we covered pickling produce. July, we talked about canning acidic and acidified foods. And then in August, we had guest presenters and we reviewed making and selling juice in Minnesota. In case you were able to were unable to join one of those previous webinars, Julie is sharing a link to the YouTube playlist on our YouTube channel in the chat. So I'm Amy Johnston, and I am today's speaker. I'm a regional extension educator with the University of Minnesota Extension, working in the area of food safety. And then with us today is Julie Larson, who is here to assist with any technical difficulties. You can direct message Julie in the Zoom chat if you're experiencing any problems. She'll also be sharing links and information throughout the webinar as well. And then just to note, all of the links that are shared today will be included in the follow-up email that'll come out early next week. So if you miss one, don't worry, you'll get it in the email. So let's dive in. We have a full agenda today. So again, I'll be taking questions at the end. So today we'll start by reviewing key definitions and identifying types of low acid foods. Next, we'll dig into pressure canning and we have a video example. And when we are reviewing the pressure canning, I'll explain why the pressure is critical to making safe canned low acid foods. And then we'll discuss recipe resources, and then we'll move into a high-level overview of how to sell low-acid food products in Minnesota. So whether you are joining us to benefit your food business or you just want to learn more, I hope you leave this webinar with increased confidence in your ability to prevent foodborne illness. So at the end of this webinar, you'll be able to identify low-acid foods, be able to explain why pressure canning is required for low acid foods, know how to use a pressure canner, and then be aware of the requirements for selling low acid canned foods in Minnesota. And then as always, we'll leave you with resources and help you know how to access safe recipes at the end of this webinar. Okay, so for those of you who have been joining this webinar series regularly, some of these definitions will be a review for you, but it's really important to understand these terms so you can make safe foods. So first is pH. pH is the measurement of acidity in a food. The pH scale is from 0 to 14, 0 being the most acidic, 7 being neutral, so think distilled water, and then 14 is the least acidic, which is also called basic or alkaline. The pH of a food has an impact on bacteria survival and growth. So today we'll be talking about low acid foods, which are foods that have a pH of greater than 4.6. So for those of you who were able to join the February webinar, we discussed the factors that influence pathogen growth. And you may recall our review of 3 different classifications of pathogens as it pertains to their ability to survive in an acidic environment. The majority of pathogens that cause foodborne illness in humans cannot survive in acidic foods. But they can survive in low acid foods. So again, low acid foods have a pH of greater than 4.6, and acidic foods have a pH of 4.6 or less. Hot pack is a term used to describe how the food and liquid is put into a jar before canning. In the hot pack method, the food is heated in a liquid and both the hot food and the hot liquid are put into jars. A recipe will indicate if a hot pack method should be used. This is recommended for dense foods because it's going to take longer amount of time for that internal temperature of the food to reach a safe temperature. Raw pack is a term used again, for how the food and the liquid are put into a jar before canning. In raw pack method, the food is not cooked in a liquid prior to putting that into the jar. The liquid is likely hot, but again, the food has not yet been heated. A raw pack method is good for foods that will lose their texture or maybe some color if they're heated for too long, or they're able to reach a safe internal temperature pretty quickly in that canning process. Headspace, that's the empty space in a jar between the top of the food and the bottom of the jar lid. This empty space is needed for 2 safety purposes. First, as the liquid in the jar boils, it needs somewhere to expand. So this headspace provides a space so the liquid does not interfere with the seal of the jar. And then the headspace is also needed when that vacuum is created during the processing and the cooling to get that tight seal. And then thermal processing, which is just another way to say the heat treatment that is used to inactivate pathogens and create a vacuum to seal that container. When we talk about canning, there are 2 different thermal processing methods: boiling water bath or atmospheric steam canning, which are considered a mild heat treatment. And then there's pressure canning, which we'll be talking about today, which is a more intense heat treatment as the pressure in the device raises the boiling temperature. The type of thermal processing that is needed is influenced by other food safety control factors like pH. So low acid foods, because they have that pH of greater than 4.6, must be processed in a pressure canner using that intense thermal processing. And that's because in low acid foods, Clostridium botulinum is our main pathogen of concern. if you think back to some of the other pathogens we've talked to in other webinars, like E. coli, those are going to be inactivated at a lower temperature during the heat treatment, which is why they can be inactivated in that milder heat treatment in like a boiling water or the atmospheric steam. It takes a much higher temperature for the Clostridium botulinum spores to be inactivated. And this temperature is extremely important in low acid foods because we don't have that additional food safety control of the acid like we do in acidic or acidified foods. So the low acid canned food is an ideal environment for those Clostridium botulinum spores to turn into a vegetative cell and then produce the toxin that causes botulism. Again, those spores like a low acid and anaerobic, so little or no oxygen, and they want a good food source. So a low acid canned food is ideal for them. So properly processing these foods is essential to minimizing that risk. Yeast molds, especially those molds that produce mycotoxins, can be in a product if it's not prepared correctly, or if the jar doesn't seal properly during processing. So another potential concern that we want to have on our radars when we're making our canned foods. So again, proper processing of these low acid canned foods in a pressure canner minimizes the risks of these pathogens. So what are low acid foods? Low acid foods are the foods that have a pH of greater than 4.6, and they are in a few different categories. Certain fruits are low acid. You can see on the screen, there's an image of white flesh peaches. Those are low acid. Their relative, the yellow flesh peach, that one is acidic. So it's important to understand that there can be differences between the types of similar fruits. Other low acid fruits include things like certain melons, bananas, mangoes, Asian pears are kind of on the edge. They can have a pH up to 4.8. Elderberries have a pH around 4.9, and some apricots also have a pH of greater than 4.6. Vegetables are low acid foods, and Julie is going to share in the chat a resource from Clemson University that's just a chart of some common foods, their pH values. So it's a listing of quite a few fruits and vegetables just to help you make some decisions. Meat, poultry, and seafood, those are all low acid foods, and this includes eggs. And then legumes, so beans and lentils, those are low acid foods as well as soy and soy-based foods like tofu. So these foods must be canned in that pressure canner. In food manufacturing, the equipment would be called a retort machine instead of a pressure canner, but the principle is the same, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. So what about tomatoes? So we talked about tomatoes a little bit in the July webinar, because when we're canning tomatoes, whether we're using a boiling water bath or a steam canner or a pressure canner, tomatoes, when you're canning them, always need to be acidified. And the pH of tomatoes varies naturally depending on the type and growing conditions and its ripeness and a lot of other factors. So again, tomatoes, we're always going to acidify them, adding either 5% vinegar, lemon juice, or a citric acid. And again, They can be processed in both that boiling water or the pressure canning. The processing times are going to differ based on those two different thermal processing methods. And Julie's going to share in the chat a link to a quick reference guide. There's three different sections on that page. One is all about tomatoes. There's a low acid foods and then an acidic foods as well. It's a good reference chart. Okay, so pressure canners. There's two types of pressure canners. There's the weighted gauge and then the dial gauge. And one is not better than the other. They both have the same function. The difference is that the dial gauge canner needs to be tested for accuracy on a routine basis. And that's generally recommended, once a year. So Julie's going to share another link in the chat with recommendations for getting your dial gauge pressure canner tested. A weighted gauge canner is going to come with a weight or weights for 5, 10, and 15 PSI, and PSI stands for pounds per square inch, and that's the measure of pressure. And that's how it's going to be regulated in your processing. So I just have a couple different diagrams or images of pressure canners, and I'll point out some key features. So you can see in the bottom of this illustration, there is the jar rack, and this is important again for water to be able to circulate and then for that steam to be produced and then being able to circulate freely. We don't want the jars sitting on the bottom. We don't want to use a towel. It needs to be a perforated rack. The pressure canner needs to have a tight seal, so a gasket is around the lid. These can become cracked or worn over time, so it's important to make sure that they're pliable, they're not cracked, or they're not dried out. And there's also a safety feature, either called a safety fuse or a counterweight on many of these. The jar rack, using the correct amount of water and then having that tight seal all impact what's happening inside the pressure canner. So boiling occurs when water pressure or steam above a liquid equals the air pressure inside the canner. So in our steam pressure and our air pressure are the same, that's when boiling happens. So in pressure canning, that's what's getting manipulated to increase that temperature. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the example. Here's another image, just to give another kind of look and seeing how parts might be named differently depending on the manufacturer. So other safety features can include a locking bracket or an overpressure plug. And again, there's a handful of different manufacturers of pressure canners and some models that are no longer in production. So it's really important to read the manufacturer's instructions for details on a specific model because there could be some differences. And this is just a couple examples of what that industrial or that commercial canning could look like. So again, that's called a retort machine. The image of the two gentlemen pushing a rack of canned, it's a example of a small family business that makes and cans sauerkraut. So they originally were doing it in small batches. Once their business grew, they found a co-packer and are making it in this facility. So the concept is the same, with the pressure being increased to get that food canned. And then this is an example of, the other image is an example of like the control panel. So in a retort machine, you're going to have a lot more digital control versus just monitoring the weighted gauge or the dial gauge. You can set programming and have continuous monitoring and everything at that scale. So the majority of Minnesota, again, this is a repeat for a lot of you if you've been joining this webinar series. The majority of Minnesota is at an elevation of about 1,200 feet, with some higher elevations in southwest Minnesota, such as Lincoln, Pipestone, Rock, Murray, Nobles, Jackson, and Cottonwood counties. And then our highest and lowest points are up in that Cook County and Lake Superior area. So when you're looking at a recipe, that safe recipe is always going to include processing instructions, and that processing instructions are going to include the style pack, the jar size, and your processing time. So while this might look similar to some of the charts we've looked at in previous months, you'll notice that there's now a new category added to this chart, and that is PSI at elevation. And again, that PSI is pounds per square inch, and that's going to be our pressure. And so it's in the measurement of pounds. And it's really important to pay attention to the type of canner, as dial gauge and weighted gauge will have a different PSI recommendation, or not recommendation, requirement. So here's an example of that. So here's an example of pressure canning asparagus. So when using the dial gauge, which is the chart on top, for an elevation of 0 to 2,000 feet, you can see we need 11 pounds of pressure. And then there's our different processing time for pints and quarts, and we can use either style of pack. The bottom chart shows the processing time for the asparagus using a weighted gauge. So another difference now you can see here is that for the weighted gauge, there's only two categories of elevation. It's 0 to 1,000 or above 1,000. And then you can see that the pressure for us here in Minnesota would be 15 pounds. So again, making sure you understand what type of pressure canner you have, knowing your elevation, knowing your jar size, and then understanding then your pounds of pressure that you need, and then the correct processing time. Those all should be included in a safe recipe. The processing times, just a review of why the processing times can be different. So processing times are impacted by the type of food and the amount of liquid that is in the jar. So the image you see on the screen has 3 jars. There's a solid product, a liquid product, and then a solid and a liquid product. So the solid product, it's going to take the most time to heat the food that's right there in the center of the jar. So it likely is going to have a longer processing time because it's going to take, there's less liquid in there, less water. So it's going to take a little bit longer for all of that to heat up. The jar in the middle, the liquid product, that's going to heat up the fastest. That liquid is going to have 2 kind of currents developing inside that jar. So the heat is really circulating. It's heating up everything really quickly. The slowest point to heat is kind of at the bottom of the jar, right where those two currents are, right below where those two currents are overlapping. That's where when they're testing a recipe for safety and processing time, that's where they're going to be measuring for that temperature and time. And then a solid and liquid product, the point slowest to heat is going to be in that bottom third of the jar, and that's just because the currents of the liquid are going to be interrupted just by the solid food product in there, but it will heat up quicker than a fully solid product. So again, just some differences, or some reasons why you might see differences in processing times, depending on the type of food. It's also another reason why it's very important to follow the cut size details in the recipe, because that'll impact how much food and then also how much liquid is inside your jar, which is what was tested in that recipe to make sure that we're getting enough heat penetration and making a safe product. Okay, so now let's walk through in an example. And in this example, we're going to be canning potatoes. And these videos are part of a project with two very, very talented master gardener food preservation consultants. So for any produce, it's really, really important to thoroughly wash that produce before cutting and getting it ready to can. So these potatoes were scrubbed and then peeled. And then again, it's important to follow the cut size instructions in a recipe, as that size of the food and then the amount of the liquid in the jar are what were tested to get the right processing time and to reach that safe minimum internal temperature. These potatoes are being blanched before canning, and this is because they're very starchy. If they were not blanched, it would take an extremely long time to process from raw, and the final temperature would probably be very unappealing. And while it isn't shown in this video, we're also keeping the jars warm in a pot of water. And this is just to prevent the glass from shattering when they're filled and processed. So we are adding salt to each jar. That is optional. If you do add salt, recommendation to use that canning or that pickling salt, just to prevent the clouding of the liquid during the canning and storage. Other salts, might have other minerals or things in there that they're not going to cause a safety issue, but could cause a visual quality issue. The hot potatoes are added to each jar. This recipe is a hot pack style. So again, that means our food is going to be hot, and then our liquid is also hot. So we are going to just be adding fresh hot water right around 180 degrees. We're not going to use the blanching water because that could be very cloudy from all the starch that was released from the potatoes. And then I believe back in April, we talked about hard water and how this can also cause cloudiness in your foods. So if you have very hard water, you can consider boiling that water, letting it cool and sit for 24 hours to allow those minerals to settle out, and then ladle out the water that you need. Or you can use a bottled water. Again, just a consideration if you have very hard water. Removing the air bubbles, just getting all of the product in there, removing any pieces of potato that are causing us to go up into that headspace. For the potatoes, we need 1 inch headspace is what the recipe calls for, because there is quite a bit of liquid in there, and that pressure that we're going to be creating in there, we're going to make a lot of boiling. That liquid needs a place to go. And then wiping the rim of the jar to ensure we have a clean seal with that lid. And then putting on the ring just to hold the flat in place during processing. Okay. I'm on video, you can, there we go. So we have water simmering in the pressure canner, again, about 180 degrees. The amount of water in the bottom of the pressure canner will depend on the size of your device. So read the manufacturer instructions. So for example, a 10-quart pressure canner is going to need less water in the bottom than a 41-quart pressure canner. So just, again, read those manufacturer instructions and make note of that. Again, you can see the rack in the bottom, and she is placing the jars carefully in there to not be touching one another. So we have that good circulation of the water, and then for that steam to be able to flow. And this canner is large enough that we're able to process 2 layers of jars. So a second perforated tray is used. So again, the steam can circulate around all of those jars. When she's loading the canner, she's making sure, again, to allow space between all of the jars. So we have that room for the steam to flow. Then the lid is locked into place. Again, this will look different depending on the model that you have. So I'm going to pause that really quick. So right now you can see that we have the vent port closed. So before the vent port was closed, we had that open, either the vent port or sometimes called the petcock. And we're going to turn up the heat on high, let that water boil until steam is coming out of that for about 10 minutes. And this venting, this exhausting is a really important step, because once that vent port or the petcock gets closed, the pressure inside the canner is going to increase. So after this venting, the inside of the sealed pressure canner, that's when the magic is going to start. So as the water continues to boil, and makes steam, the vapor pressure inside the canner is going to increase, which is then also going to increase then our air pressure. And remember that boiling occurs when the steam pressure and the air pressure are equal. So as the air pressure increases, the temperature of the water, the temperature that the water needs to boil is going to increase. And it's this cycle until we get the desired pressure that we want. And once we hit that desired pressure, we can turn down the heat to maintain that heat. And once the processing pressure is reached, that's when our processing time is going to start. And depending on your model, so in this video, we have the dial gauge. So we'll monitor that dial gauge to make sure we're at our right pressure. Or if you're using a weighted gauge, it'd be when that gauge is jiggling at the correct PSI. So once our potatoes are done processing and we've turned off the heat, it's really important to not immediately open the canner. This is both for food safety and for your own safety. The pressure canner needs to depressurize. So this had been sitting for a little while. She took off the vent port, letting any other residual steam come out, let that pressure continue to drop. And once there was no further dropping in that pressure, we were able to then take off the lid. It's really important to not interfere with the depressurizing step because that is also important for creating that vacuum seal that's going to help keep our jars sealed and safe. You can see that the food in there is still extremely hot. It is boiling, so it's okay to let that sit in there for a little bit more time to continue to let that food cool. You can start to listen for that loud pop or that loud click sound of those jars sealing. So carefully remove the jars from your canner. Again, they are still quite hot. Again, that liquid is still boiling. And again, you can start to listen for that pop or that click as the jars sealed. Once they are cooled, you can then touch them to see if the lid moves up and down to make sure it is sealed. So again, when we're checking the seals, these are two examples of improperly sealed. You can see that the lid moves up and down. These were not sealed in their canner, so they can either be reprocessed or put into the refrigerator and used that way. So as always, there are recipes, tips, tricks, hacks, whatever you want to call it, everywhere you look when you're researching food preservation. So again, what are some of those safe research-based recipes? So the USDA Guide to Home Canning, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, educational institutions like Extension, and Ball publications from 1994 or newer are all research-based sources. When you are searching online to really refine your searches, so this would take out any, those blogs or, Pinterest, things like that. In your search engine, you can type in your keyword or phrase followed by site:/.edu. So example, you could search pressure canning carrots at home site:/.edu, and that's only going to bring up resources that are from educational institutions. So again, while there are a lot of research-based tested recipes out there, what if you have that family recipe that's been passed down from generation to generation, or you want to create your own? The simplest way is to follow the safe substitution guidelines. For example, you can adjust herbs or spices. You can do a mixed vegetable blend, or you can add some different seasonings to meats that you're going to be canning. Julie's going to share in the chat a guide to making safe substitutions. If you were going to be making a mixed vegetable blend, let's say you were going to do carrots and green beans, you need to use the processing time that's the longest. So I don't have the processing times pulled up in front of me. I should have. But let's say, you know, carrots have a processing time of 40 minutes and the green beans have a processing time of 30 minutes. You need to use the 40 minutes because that's the longest processing time to make all of the ingredients inside that jar safe. And again, however, if you do want to get very creative and develop your own recipe using principles that we've discussed in this webinar and past webinars, you need to have that recipe tested to make sure that it is safe, that you're having the right processing time and that right internal temperature in these low acid canned foods to ensure that they are safe. Then just a couple of troubleshooting resources. If you are having some difficulties, there is the Causes and Possible Solutions for Problems with Canned Foods. It's a helpful publication from the National Center of Home Food Preservation. And then there's also the wonderful team of food preservation experts at the Answer Line. The Answer Line is a joint collaboration between Iowa State University Extension and University of Minnesota. And there is the contact information for them. And they also have a really helpful blog that you can follow or search. And Julie will be sharing those in the chat. And just to drive home the point of really making sure that you're using a research-based tested recipe and process with these low acid canned foods was unfortunately a recent example here this year out in Fresno, California. An individual had home canned nopales, so part of the cactus, and they did not follow a recipe. The cactus pads were not acidified, so they were just cut, prepared, and they were canned using a boiling water method. So they were a low acid food canned using the boiling water method, which is not going to reach a high enough temperature to inactivate those Clostridium botulinum spores. Once they were canned, they were stored in a shed outside in May in California. So those jars definitely were then at a very warm temperature, not being stored in a cool, dry place. They were stored for about a month before they were served at a family event. So in less than a month, the amount of toxin that was produced by these spores was so significant that 10 were sickened, and 2 individuals were actually hospitalized. Initial symptoms with vertigo and blurred vision, and their symptoms progressed. They did recover, but again, it's just hammering home that point that low acid foods need to be canned using that pressure canner and need to be processed with the correct processing time and correct pressure. So selling your low acid canned products, low acid canned foods cannot be sold as a cottage food product. A cottage food products are home processed and home canned in Minnesota. Um, and they must have that for a canned food like this, they must have that equilibrium pH of 4.6 or less. So cottage foods, one of the criteria is that that acidity. So cottage foods have to be that acidic food of a pH of 4.6 or less. And our low acid foods have that pH above that. The other requirement is water activity, but that does not pertain to the pressure canning that we're talking about today. If you are using a pressure canner to can like your acidified tomato products, those can be sold as a cottage food because those are acidic. It's just the low acid food having that pH of greater than 4.6 cannot be sold. So if you are looking to make and sell low acid foods, it would have to be under that licensed food processor manufacturer route. And that will require some following of the Code of Federal Regulations, that CFR Part 113, thermally processed low acid foods packaged in hermetically sealed containers. So that's all of the guidance that you would need for that. There is a training requirement before you can make and sell these low acid foods, and that's a Better Process Control School for low acid canned foods. Julie is going to share a link in the chat about this. This Better Process Control Foods covers all of the information that you need to know to set up your procedures and make safe products. It includes the good manufacturing practices, sanitation, thermal processing, equipment, containers and closure options, record keeping, and others. At this time, University of Minnesota does not offer that training, but the link that Julie is sharing has some ways to find other options for that training, or you can always contact me and I can help you find a training. After completing the training, you'll be able to establish your own procedures. You'll complete a scheduled process. And that scheduled process includes all of the processing steps related to the safety of that food. That scheduled process is then reviewed by a process authority to ensure that everything is done properly to prevent those food safety risks. You'll register with the FDA, obtain your license from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, MDA, and then be able to produce and then have those routine inspections. Okay, well, that is all of the information I wanted to share today. As always, your feedback is very important. If you want to take just a couple minutes to complete the evaluation survey, you can scan the QR code or follow the link. Julie's going to share the link in the chat. And then next month, our webinar is going to be about dehydrating and drying produce. So you can follow the link or scan the QR code for more information and register for that webinar.